My name is Jacob Miller. I am 65 years old today. I am sitting in the absolute dark of my kitchen, recording this text onto an old magnetic tape. For 30 long years, I have lived completely alone on a remote cattle ranch in eastern Montana. The people in the nearest town call me a paranoid old fool who lost his mind decades ago. They see the 12-foot-high reinforced steel fences around my land, and they laugh at me. They see the black heavy iron shutters bolted onto my windows, and they turn their heads away. But they do not know what the federal government buried beneath my pasture in 1985. Before the grid went silent, I was a young 25-year-old farmer taking over my family estate. My grandfather built this ranch with his own bare hands after the Second World War, and on his deathbed in the county hospital, he gripped my wrist with an impossible bone-crushing force. His eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling, and his breath smelled of cold medicine and old earth. He looked straight into my face and whispered a single strict rule for the land. He said, "Jacob, you can manage the fields, you can sell the wheat, you can breed the Black Angus cattle, but you must never under any circumstances count the herd after midnight." I thought it was just an old farmer's superstition born from isolation and rural madness. I thought he was just losing his cognitive functions to the tumor in his brain cells. For 5 years I kept that promise simply out of respect for his memory. We had 300 head of commercial cattle moving across the lower valley hills. But on the winter night of November 12, 1985, the rules of our universe died. It was exactly 3:14 a.m. when the automatic water pumps in the north sector stopped working. The heavy electrical breakers didn't trip. The copper fuses inside the box were completely cold. The power grid didn't just fail, it felt like the electric current was physically sucked out of the copper wires. I stepped out onto the dark wooden front porch, holding my heavy iron flashlight and my loaded rifle. The mountain air was freezing cold, but it didn't smell like winter frost or pine needles. The atmosphere smelled heavily of pure ozone, burnt silver crystals, and fresh industrial machine oil. There was no wind moving through the valley, no coyotes howling, no sounds of night insects or birds. A complete and absolute silence had descended over the entire county territory. I walked down the muddy tractor trail toward the secondary barn, where the young calves were locked. As I approached the old wooden fence line, my flashlight beam began to flicker and turn a dim violet color. The silver grains inside the lens element were actively warping from an immense static charge in the air. I looked out into the center of the dark pasture field, and my heart slammed against my ribs like a trapped animal. 20 of my best Black Angus cattle were standing in a perfect, flawless geometric circle in the middle of the grass. They weren't chewing, they weren't moving their heavy tails, they weren't breathing the cold air. Their front legs were rigid, their heads were all tilted backward at a sharp, unnatural 90-degree angle. They were staring straight up into the empty black space between the frozen star constellations. And right above the circle of cattle, the heavy winter clouds were parting, forming a perfect tunnel miles wide. An absolute, silent, dark void that completely blocked out the light of the moon and the sky. I stood frozen by the rotten wooden fence posts, unable to draw a clean breath of air. The heavy iron rifle in my hands felt like a useless piece of cold winter stone. I reached my left hand deep into my utility coat pocket to find my portable thermal camera. Our family used these advanced military-grade infrared devices to to track missing calves during storm nights. I raised the small plastic viewfinder to my right eye and adjusted the coarse manual focus ring. The digital liquid crystal screen illuminated my face with a sharp, intense amber and green glow. On the screen, the 20 black Angus cattle showed up as bright, blinding white heat signatures. But when I tilted the camera lens upward toward the open circular cloud tunnel, my palms turned slick. The high-resolution infrared sensor didn't record empty black space or cold mountain air. A colossal, perfectly formed white silhouette over 900 feet tall was standing right over my house. The entity had long, thin arms that stretched down like tree trunks and a massive, featureless head. It was completely and terrifyingly invisible to my bare human eyes, but its thermal output was real. The digital temperature readout in the center of my screen was climbing rapidly past 400 degrees. The internal cooling microfans of the thermal camera began to scream under the massive load. The giant slowly raised its long, thin arm, extending a single sharp needle-like digit from the clouds. The tip of the needle was hovering an inch above the roof of my bedroom, where my daughter Lily was sleeping. I tried to scream her name into the frozen night, but my throat felt lined with hot lead and sand. Then my cellular phone inside my pocket vibrated with a sharp electric shock that hit my thigh. The screen turned on by itself, displaying a single text message from an unregistered encryption source. The text line's font was written in a raw, blocky military command code script. The message read, "The biological asset of Sector 65 has documented the outline of the collector unit. Do not engage in verbal thinking, or the tracking vectors will permanently align with your brain cells. The entity has initiated the primary extraction sequence for the local family database." I looked back through the green viewfinder and saw hundreds of thin, glowing lines appearing. They were descending from the needle digit directly into the timbered roof of my house, pulsing with energy. I dropped the thermal camera into the freezing mud and sprinted toward the front porch. My boots felt like they weighed 50 pounds each as the gravity inside the valley began to shift. I slammed my body against the heavy oak front door, throwing the manual iron deadbolt into the frame. The interior of my living room was completely dark, and the air was colder than a meat locker. The window glass was covered in a thick layer of white frost, forming perfect geometric matrix lines. I ran up the stairs toward my daughter Lily's bedroom, pushing the door open with my shoulder. The small room was illuminated by a faint, pale violet light that was bleeding directly from the ceiling. Lily was sitting perfectly upright in her bed, her eyes wide open, staring at the window pane. She wasn't crying, she wasn't blinking her eyelids, she wasn't moving her small hands. And pressed tightly against her left ear was the physical handset of our old rotary telephone. The long black cord was stretched across the floor, disappearing into the dark heating vent opening. Her mouth was completely closed and sealed shut like a solid piece of white marble stone. But through the microphone of the telephone receiver, I could hear her voice broadcasting onto the line. The sound was vibrating out from her chest cavity, through her skin, without her lips moving a single hertz. Her voice was repeating a single phrase with a perfect mechanical text-to-speech intonation. "Dad, the man under the apple tree, has been standing there for 60 years. He is just waiting for the recording tape to finish its rotation, Dad." The grandfather clock in the hallway stopped its pendulum frozen mid-swing at 3:14. But the clicking sound didn't vanish. It grew louder, vibrating the wooden floorboards beneath my feet. Thousands of small silver needles were pushing out from the baseboard telephone wire box, tracing smooth matrix lines across the wallpaper, scratching the plaster away into white chemical dust. The radio on my knitstand clicked on by itself, emitting a loud, high-pitched, static squeal. A soft, clear, calm voice of an old woman came through the encrypted frequency channel. The speaker said, "Subject Jacob Miller has returned to the containment sector ahead of the synchronization schedule. The logic script for 1985 is experiencing structural resistance from the asset. Execute the purge protocol for the local family database units immediately." The white walls of my daughter's bedroom began to warp and bend inward like wet cardboard. The air grew so thick with nitrogen and ozone that my vision started to blur into gray blocks of pixels. The physical timber frame of the house was losing its density, turning transparent like tracing paper. Through the vanishing walls, I saw the open pasture field outside where the cattle stood. The 20 black Angus cows were no longer organic animals. Their skin had dissolved into black fluid oil, revealing complex structures of dark cables and silver acoustic diaphragms beneath the flesh matrix. They were biological receivers transmitting our vocal data back into the giant cloud funnel. Suddenly, my consciousness was pulled backward out of my body with a violent kinetic force. I wasn't standing in the Montana farmhouse anymore. I was floating in a cold, gray vacuum void, looking down into a secret underground military bunker complex built deep beneath the mountains. A reinforced concrete facility located at Cheyenne Mountain, Colorado during the Cold War era. The digital calendar on the central wall read November 14, 1985. Around a massive metal terminal table sat 12 high-ranking military officers and defense scientists. They were looking at a shared monitor display showing early satellite photos of my Montana ranch. A red indicator light was blinking off the coordinate field, marking the location of my pasture. A general stood up, his hands shaking as he pointed at the giant thermal silhouette on the screen. He said the outer membrane has mapped 80% of the Western Hemisphere network grid. The entities aren't invading us with weapons, they are harvesting our awareness parameters. The more human eyes focus on the outline of the predator, the faster the cage closes its knots. We signed the agreement in 1974 to keep the population completely blind, to turn off our radar systems, to delete the satellite logs, to force humanity to look down at the soil. But the farmer Jacob Miller has used an active thermal camera to record the needle digit. He has popped the spatial insulation bubble for the entire sector of Montana. The scene inside the Colorado bunker began to glitch and tear apart into gray data blocks. The voice of the old woman returned inside my head with a loud, high-frequency static roar. She said, "Jacob, you have contaminated the sequence with your observation tool. Now welcome the team inside your bedroom window." I fell back onto the cold wooden floorboards of my house, coughing up gray metallic fluid. The layout of the bedroom was completely gone, now replaced by a long clinical corridor. The pale violet light from the ceiling panels shifted into a cold, sterile green color. My body was sitting upright in a heavy iron chair with wide leather straps holding my wrists. I looked down at my hands and realized my skin was old, wrinkled, and covered in brown age spots. I wasn't 25 years old anymore. I was an old man, trapped inside a broken frame. Standing directly in front of my chair was a doctor in a clean white medical coat. He had a small silver pen in his pocket and a clipboard with official hospital stamps. He looked at me with a deep expression of sadness and professional exhaustion. He said, "Jacob, can you hear my voice today? Do you know where you are standing? There was no spaceship in 1985, and there was no invisible giant on your ranch. You were a young farmer who was caught in a catastrophic silo explosion on your property. The severe head trauma and hypoxia created an irreversible destruction of your temporal lobe. Your brain built a massive cosmic narrative to protect your mind from the memory of the fire. You turned the hospital walls into an alien craft. You turned the syringes into silver wires. Your wife and your daughter didn't disappear into a cloud funnel, Jacob. They have been dead for 30 years, buried in the cemetery behind the local church." I stared at his human face, my mind freezing with a wave of absolute psychological terror. The text on his clipboard read Oregon State Psychiatric Hospital, Unit 4. But then I looked past his shoulder toward the wide concrete wall of the medical ward. The white plaster was starting to peel away in long vertical lines like old film reels. And beneath the paint I saw the smooth, reflective black obsidian glass pulsing in the dark. The dark matter veins were expanding and contracting every 11 seconds in a perfect rhythm. The old grandfather clock on the hospital wall began to click with a heavy metallic sound. The ticking wasn't regular. It matched the exact frequency of the boiling gold fluid. D.R. Miller stepped away from my vinyl chair, walking toward the retro television set in the corner. The heavy wooden cabinet of the TV was buzzing, emitting a strong smell of melting plastic. The glass tube screen flickered to life, displaying a black and white emergency channel broadcast. The presenter on the screen didn't have features. His face was a smooth layer of gray graphite. He was showing a digital schematic diagram of my family ranch in eastern Montana. And from the small plastic speakers of the television set, a voice began to count backward. It was the exact same layered mechanical tone of the old woman from the radio frequency. The voice said, 10-987-65-43210. The 40-year archive for the biological asset Jacob Miller has reached its terminal threshold. The containment logic script injected into his neural core is losing its integrity frames. The older asset has merged the two independent data tracks inside his memory cells. Prepare the local grid field team to terminate the psychiatric hospital simulation layer. I looked through the wide panoramic window of the ward out onto the city streets below. The buildings, the cars, the pedestrians were all losing their physical material density. The brick walls were tearing apart into long vertical strips of empty gray tracking noise. The people on the sidewalks were walking backward in a perfect synchronized inverted sequence. Their mouths were opened wide, frozen in that unhinged position, broadcasting the sub-bass drone. The entire city of Portland was just a temporary program running on an old magnetic tape reel, a logic shield built 60 years ago to keep my conscious brain cells blind inside the dark. And the doctor turned his featureless face toward my seat, his silver pen pulsing with light. The needles around his wrist joints began to vibrate, filling my ears with a deafening squeal. The leather straps around my wrinkled wrists grew uncomfortably hot within seconds. The thick white paint on the concrete walls of the ward was blistering and bubbling away, revealing the hidden structure of smooth, reflective black obsidian glass beneath the plaster. The dark, organic muscle tissues on the stone were pulsing, expanding every 11 seconds. The tired doctor in the white coat didn't try to hold my shoulders down to the vinyl seat. His physical body began to dissolve, melting down into a thick, black-silver liquid oil. The liquid ran across the clipboard, shorting out the electrical switches of the terminal desk. The nurse in the corner turned her head at a sharp, unnatural 90-degree angle toward me. Her face was no longer human. It was a smooth, polished, dark visor skin with no features. And inside the visor, I could see the reflection of my house from 1985, the burning red circle of the pasture field where the black Angus cattle stood in the mud. The radio receiver on the medical table exploded with a high-frequency static feedback roar. A voice came through the distortion, layered with hundreds of overlapping monotone frequencies. The voice said, "Subject Jacob Miller has bypassed the secondary logic security barrier of the block. The memory of the forest fire and the hospital is no longer containment compliant. He is tracking the electrical signal of the main circuit breaker back to the core." The ceiling fluorescent light tubes exploded one by one, showering the floor with glass dust, leaving the entire psychiatric ward in an absolute dark cave save for the violet light. The gravity inside the room failed, completely shifting toward the open gap in the ceiling panels. My iron chair began to float upward, the metal legs breaking away from the concrete floor, and inside my skull bones a single command resonated with terrifying high-definition clarity. "Do not attempt to touch the primary power lever of the tracking station, Jacob." The iron buckles of the leather straps snapped with a sharp electrical crackle. My free left arm felt heavy and old, my joints clicking with a deep bone pain. I slid out of the floating vinyl chair, landing on the damp obsidian floor plates. The floor was hot to the touch, smelling of ozone copper and scorched silver crystals. I crawled underneath the melting terminal desks, my flashlight beam cutting the smoke. Behind the primary mainframe rack I found the heavy iron junction circuit box. The metal box was sealed inside a bright red casing marked Emergency Destruct Core. The lever inside was covered in a thick layer of dark violet frost that smelled of sulfur. I reached out both my trembling hands, grabbing the iron handle with all my remaining weight. The moment my bare skin connected with the frost, a massive electrical surge hit my head. I wasn't standing inside the dark psychiatric ward corridor anymore. I was a 7-year-old boy sitting in the back seat of my grandfather's vintage truck. We were driving past the old construction gates of the Montana pasture facility at midnight. My grandfather was looking at me through the rearview mirror, his face completely expressionless. He said, "Jacob, remember this night because you are the anchor for the next sequence track. You are the one who will have to press the repeat button when the time marker arrives." The memory was so real, I could smell the wet grass and the rainy autumn mountain wind. Then the timeline glitched row by row, layer by layer, like a damaged magnetic tape reel. I saw my grandfather standing in a dark concrete vault, surrounded by military generals. They were looking at a massive glowing capsule, filled with dark silver wires and violet oil, and inside the capsule was a young boy sleeping with a mechanical visor on his skull. The boy inside the fluid was myself, Jacob Miller, born August 12, 1956. I realized a terrifying truth about my entire existence inside the Montana sector. I wasn't a farmer who took over the family land 40 years ago in 1985. I was an artificial asset created inside the lab during the first calibration phase a biological component designed to keep the memory track of the loop sequence stable. Every 40 years they wake a copy of me up to pull the lever, because only my brain matches the core. The countdown indicator on the system display reached exactly 5 seconds remaining. The giant circular magnetic head inside the cloud tunnel opened its central iris wide, revealing an endless dark void filled with thousands of spinning metallic spheres. And the violet veins on the walls were tightening their knots, preparing to wipe my mind clean. I pulled the heavy iron lever down to the bottom socket with a desperate final scream. The iron lever hit the bottom of the steel box with a deafening mechanical click. A massive blinding wave of pure white energy blasted from the circuit breaker terminal. The old cathode ray tube monitors exploded simultaneously, showering the platform with glass dust. The current running through the copper wires was so hot the metal turned into liquid gold lines. I felt my physical body dissolving, turning into a stream of raw digital data packets. The walls of the control booth, the server frames, the concrete ceiling, everything became transparent. Through the vanishing architecture, I saw the entire state of Montana from a high-altitude view. The towns, the roads, the power lines were all vibrating in perfect synchronization with the rails. The physical space of the continent was folding inward like a piece of paper being compressed. Every house, every car, every human being was flickering like a projection on a damaged screen. They weren't dying, their biological timelines were being wound back frame by frame. I saw the cities getting smaller, the highways disappearing, the forests growing thicker. The memory of my daughter Lily's face began to distort, turning into a gray block of static code. I tried to scream her name into the void, but my vocal cords were no longer human tissue. They had turned into a cluster of silver wires vibrating at a frequency of 0 hertz. The giant magnetic recording head beneath the mountain ridge reached peak rotation volume. Its dark matter iris was swallowing the entire light spectrum of the sector. I saw thousands of past cycles of my own life running simultaneously inside the void. Thousands of versions of Jacob Miller pulling the exact same iron lever every 40 years. All of us were trapped inside the same track of the cosmic record disk, an endless loop of infrastructure monitoring and corporate isolation under the granite crust. The countdown timer on the main mainframe terminal reached 0 and the system reset. A sharp, high-pitched ringing sound filled my entire consciousness, shattering my thoughts. The white light expanded, completely swallowing the mountain, the void, and the timeline, and I dropped down into a deep, silent darkness that felt completely clean of information, leaving the planet in a state of absolute frozen stillness before the next loop. The white light didn't fade out slowly. It snapped into a cold, gray, dark line. I woke up sitting upright in a mechanical operator chair in front of a console desk. The air inside the room smelled heavily of dry paper, fresh pine wood, and ozone. I checked my hands, my fingers, my uniform coat. Everything looked perfectly normal. The clock on the wall was ticking steadily, showing exactly 3:40 a.m. The year on the calendar readout was green, displaying November 12, 1985. I sat there trembling, staring at the old cathode ray tube monitor tube screen. The system initialization logs were scrolling down in clean phosphor lines, but the code wasn't running its normal sequence for the start of the cycle. A massive red system error message was flashing in the center of the display matrix. The text read, "Track data inversion detected. Sector 65 is out of calibration. The needle has deviated from the groove. I looked through the thick, reinforced glass window toward the main pasture entrance. The 20 head of cattle were sitting on the arrival platform below the fence line, but the livestock wasn't covered in white frost or frozen steam anymore. The entire structural mass of the herd was actively vibrating, moving left and right, like a digital image losing its stabilization frames on a broken tracking reel. The doors of the rear cargo containers burst open simultaneously with a loud crash, and from the interior compartments the wooden shipping crates were being thrown out. They hit the concrete platform, shattering into pieces of fresh pine splinters. But inside the straw padding, there were no flight suits or wire-filled helmets. The crates were filled with thousands of physical photograph prints and magnetic tape reels. The historical archives of the future cycles we had just erased from the timeline. The photos of my wife, the documents from 2025, the modern world. They were spilling across the tracks like a massive river of discarded data garbage. Then the heavy steel door of my control booth began to click from the corridor side. Someone was entering the manual security combination code on the external keypad. The mechanical lock turned with a slow, deliberate, heavy grinding noise. The door swung open, and my grandfather stepped into the room holding a plasma drill manual. His face looked completely normal. His eyes were clear. His uniform was pristine. But as he walked toward my desk, I realized his shadow on the wall was wrong. The shadow didn't duplicate his movement. It was moving in reverse sequence. When he took a step forward, the shadow on the basalt stone took a step backward. He looked at me with an empty, calm expression and opened his wire-filled jaw. And when he spoke, his voice was a chaotic, layered mix of my own voice and his voice. The voice said, "Jacob, you pulled the lever too early during the compression phase. The recording head has scratched the surface of the biological memory core. The loop cannot return to the starting marker of 1985 anymore. The tape is ripping Jacob, and the predator behind the wall is looking through the tear."
you.